Chapter 9. Paul Bunyan Digs the St. Lawrence River. One summer, Paul decided to leave the North Woods and go back to Maine to visit his father and mother. When he arrived, they talked about old times, and Paul asked about Billy Pilgrim, the biggest man in this part of the country. "What is Billy Pilgrim doing?" asked Paul. "He is digging the St. Lawrence between the United States and Canada," said Paul's father. There was nothing to separate the two countries. People never knew when they were in the United States and when they were in Canada. Paul Bunyan went to see Billy. He found that Billy Pilgrim and his men had been digging for 3 years and had dug only a very small ditch. Paul laughed when he saw it. "My men could dig the St. Lawrence River in 3 weeks," said Paul. This made Billy angry, for he thought no one could dig a large river in 3 weeks. "I will give you $1,000,000 if you can dig the St. Lawrence River in 3 weeks," said Billy Pilgrim. So Paul sent for Babe the Blue Ox, Ole the Big Swede, Brimstone Bill, and his woodsmen. Paul told Ole to make a huge shovel as large as a house. They fastened it to Babe with a long buckskin rope. He hauled many tons of dirt every day and emptied the scoop shovel in Vermont. You can see the large piles of dirt there to this day. They are called the Green Mountains. Every night, Johnny Inkslinger, who did the arithmetic, would take his large pencil and mark one day off the wall calendar. Billy Pilgrim was afraid they would finish digging the river on time. He did not want to pay Paul Bunyan the $1,000,000, for at heart he was a miser. So he thought of a plan to prevent Paul from finishing the work. One night, Billy called his men together and said, "When everybody has gone to bed, we will go out and pour water in on the buckskin rope so it will stretch, and Babe the Blue Ox will not be able to pull a single shovelful of dirt." The next day, Babe started toward Vermont with the first load of dirt. When he arrived there, he loaded up. He looked around, and the huge scoop shovel was nowhere to be seen. For miles and miles, the buckskin rope stretched through the forest and over the hills. Babe didn't know what to do. He sat down and tried to think, but everyone knows an ox isn't that bright, so he just sat there. After a while, the men came out and dried the buckskin, and it started to shrink to the normal size. Babe planted his large hoofs between two mountains and waited. The buckskin rope kept shrinking and shrinking. Soon the scoop shovel came into view over the hills. Then Babe emptied it and started back after another load. In exactly 3 weeks, the St. Lawrence River was all finished, but still Billy Pilgrim did not want to pay Paul the money. "Very well," said Paul. "I will remove the water." So he led Babe the Blue Ox down the river, and Babe drank the St. Lawrence River dry. Billy Pilgrim only chuckled to himself, for he knew that the first rain would fill it up again. Soon it began to rain, and the river became as large as ever. So Paul picked up a large shovel. "If you do not pay the money you owe me, I will fill the river up again," said Paul. He threw in a shovelful of dirt. He threw in another and another, but still Billy Pilgrim would not pay his money. "I will pay you half your money," said Billy. Paul again picked up his shovel and tossed more dirt into the river. "I will pay you 2/3 of your money," said Billy. Paul kept throwing dirt into the river until he had thrown 1,000 shovelfuls. "Stop! I will pay you all your money," cried Billy. So Paul was finally paid in full for digging the St. Lawrence River. The 1,000 shovelfuls of dirt are still there. They are called the Thousand Islands. I was there. They have a bunch of really unique homes on those islands on the St. Lawrence River up by New York. There's islands so small, like they're the size of a card table, and there's islands big enough to have a castle on them. So it's a pretty cool place to go visit. Number 10, Chapter 10, The Kingdom of North Dakota. Soon after Paul had finished digging the St. Lawrence River, he received a letter from the King of Sweden. It seems that the king had heard of Paul Bunyan through Ole the Big Swede. He wanted Paul to cut down all the trees in North Dakota so the Swedes could settle there and farm the land. The king wrote that he wanted this job done in 1 month so the farmers could plant their grain at once. All the trees were to be cut up and made into toothpicks for the Swedish army. When the huge job was finished, the Swedes in North America were to settle in the new kingdom of North Dakota and farm the land. This was about the largest job that Paul ever attempted. He soon gathered his men together and started moving his camp to North Dakota. When they arrived, he built the largest camp the world had ever seen. The bunks in the new sleeping quarters were 18 decks high, and the men in the top bunks had to get up an hour earlier in the morning in order to get down to breakfast on time. The dining room was longer than ever, and the boy that drove the salt and pepper wagon around the tables would only be halfway around by nightfall. He would stay overnight on the other end and drive back the next day. Paul had to finish the job in 1 month, so he hired the 7 axemen. They were famous woodsmen and could cut down trees faster than anyone except Paul himself. They were all cousins, and each was named Frank. It was very confusing because every time Paul shouted, "Frank!" all the 7 axemen would drop their work and run over to see what he wanted. The 7 axemen used great double-bitted axes that an ordinary man could not lift. When their axes became dull, they would start a round, flat rock down the hillside and run beside it, holding the blades of their axes against the rock until they were sharp again. No matter how fast they worked, the huge job was always being delayed. Paul began to have bad luck. First, Babe the Blue Ox lost his heavy iron shoe in a swamp, and a new mine had to be opened to get enough iron to make him a new set. Next came the great fog that covered the earth like a blanket. It was so thick that the fish in the river couldn't tell where the water left off and the fog began. They swam around in the fog and got lost among the trees in the forest. When the fog disappeared, thousands of small fish were left in the woods many miles from the nearest stream. The 7 axemen had to chop a tunnel in the fog from the kitchen to the dining room so the cooks could serve food. The fog even got into the coffee and made it so weak the men couldn't drink it. At night, the men had to sleep with mosquito netting over their heads to keep the tadpoles from getting in their ears. Finally, the fog went away, but all the blankets and shirts were so wet it took 14 days to dry them out. At last, all the trees were cut down and split into toothpicks, but still the King of Sweden wasn't satisfied. He wrote Paul another letter which said, "My farmers will not be able to till the soil with all the stumps." And the farmers refused to settle in the new kingdom of North Dakota. Paul called Johnny Inkslinger into the office and said, "You are good at solving problems. What are we going to do about the stumps?" Johnny Inkslinger thought and thought for 7 days and nights. "We will send for several large fire hoses and flood the ground with water," said Johnny Inkslinger finally. Babe the Blue Ox, as you all know, doesn't like to get his feet wet, for that gives him a cold in the head. With water all over the ground, he will walk on the stumps. He is so heavy, his huge hoofs will drive the stumps to the ground. The men did as Johnny said. They covered the whole country with water. Babe roamed all over North Dakota, stepping very carefully from stump to stump to avoid getting his feet wet. His heavy weight drove the stumps 6 feet under the ground. The King of Sweden was finally satisfied, and to this day there isn't a single tree or stump in the whole state of North Dakota. Now, that's a little exaggeration, but it is pretty wide open in North Dakota. And there are very few trees on the prairie out there.